should work in a synergistic fashion, complement each other, rather than running at cross purposes. So for instance, if there is a community pond being built up, built under NREGA, then the fisheries, the agriculture department should give it, fund the pond lining. The fisheries department should fund the fingerlings, and the relevant department should actually fund the selling of the marketing of the fish. Maybe something like self-help groups or something of that kind. So if these things are integrated, converged together, all these different interventions are thought together as complementing one another, then obviously the funds which have been devolved to the Gram Panchayat will have the maximum impact. So the idea is very good, and the government of India took a very, very commendable step in 2018-19 by developing the Mission Antyodaya framework. Now, what is the Mission Antyodaya framework? The Mission Antyodaya framework is a framework for accountability. Basically, it came in the Union Budget of 1718 and is a convergence and accountability framework, which aims to bring optimum use and management of resources allocated by 27, that is 29 ministries departments of the GOI under various programs for the development of rural areas. So this is a stated initiative with GPs as the focal point of convergence efforts. As a part of this, there is now an annual survey of Gram Panchayats across the country. It's a very critical part of the Mission Antyodaya framework. Under this survey for 2018-19, 98% of Gram Panchayats across the country have been covered. In Maharashtra, 96.38% of GPs have been covered for 2018-19. It's a survey which gives data on a very vast array of amenities and public interventions at the Gram Panchayat level. For example, it will tell you whether the Gram Panchayat has a ATM, whether it is a bank, if not, then what is the distance to the nearest bank, whether Gram Panchayat is connected by a all-weather road, whether, the status of drainage in the Gram Panchayats, the status of Anganwadis in the Gram Panchayats, whether there is a PDS outlet, whether there is a school, primary school, a middle school, etc., whether there are pastures, whether there is a library, whole host of activities. In addition to that, it also gives data on interventions by various other departments. So for example, it'll give you data on self-help groups formed, farmer producer companies formed, primary producing associations, producer associations formed, number of, amount of wells, for example, amount of acreage that is irrigated by wells and groundwater and surface water, and the number of, say, improved seeds outlets, government outlets. So it gives you a very detailed, rich data set at the Gram Panchayat level. So it has data, currently these data for about 2,65,000 Gram Panchayats are publicly available on the Mission Antyodaya website, and there is the link is there. So that, it's a very useful kind of data. Now this has to be used to kind of support the making of the GPDP plans under the People's Plan mission, which was undertaken from 2000, in the 2019 from 2nd October to 31st December. The idea was to create GPDP plans in a mission mode. Now the question that we are thinking of is, okay, obviously you have all this data and you have all these 27 departments, right? So you need to think of, and convergence is obviously a good idea. But what is convergence? Convergence is basically, so you actually use the funds available and, so basically use the various schemes and policies available under various departments in a way which complement, in a way so that they complement each other and you achieve maximum impact. Well, as an idea, this is good, but does the same kind of convergence work everywhere? By saying that all departments should work together in a convergent fashion, are we really providing a concrete answer, or do we need more? If you're going to do serious GPDP planning, do we need more concrete answers? Like, okay, it is these departments, say rural development, women and child development, water resources, which ought to work together in these three, in this particular geography, it is some other department, some other schemes will work together if you want to have maximum impact on a particular problem. So the idea here is that the kind of convergence you require will vary a lot across geography and will also vary a lot about depending upon the kind of problem that the Gram Panchayat is tackling. Yeah, for example, if the Gram Panchayat is looking at livelihoods, then there's a different mix of schemes and departments that will have to be used, and that will differ across geographies. If the Gram Panchayats, if you are looking at, say, having the maximum impact on malnutrition, children's malnutrition, then you have to use different policy mixes, which will differ by geographies again, because there is a lot of context specificity. For example, we know that clean drinking water has an impact on children's health. But clean drinking water has a maximum impact on children's health where publicly available drinking water is highly polluted. Whereas in areas where that kind of pollution is not an issue, clean drinking water, piped drinking water might not have such a large impact. Right? In areas where we know that access to public health has a large impact on children's malnutrition, but that impact might vary in certain areas where people are not used to accessing. For example, certain tribal areas, I know for certain that there is still a lot of dependence upon traditional medicine where people don't necessarily go to public health care. The impact of public health care might be relatively muted. So we need to know how different, what should work in different parts of the state. Okay, and that is the kind of a question so that we are trying to answer here. We have taken the, here we are looking at the problem of malnutrition among children. Where is the data coming from? The Mission Antyodaya website has data for each Gram Panchayat. It has data on the number of children enrolled in Anganwadis, and it has the data on number of children under 6 years who are underweight. Right, so that is our definition of malnutrition. I know that we have different ways of measuring malnutrition, but that kind of data is not available at the taluka level in the GPDP, in the Mission Antyodaya website. That kind of data is available at the NFHS 2019, which is now available at the district level. And this exercise can also be replicated at the district level. But because we are looking at GPDP, Gram Panchayats, I think the taluka and the block levels are the ones which are more relevant, and therefore we are defining malnutrition in this particular way. So what are the various data sets that we are now looking at, right? So basically, I just spoke to what questions of policy, right? We are also, apart from, of course, the Mission Antyodaya data, we have also used some data from the census 2011, some data from the MG Narega website, and some data from the socioeconomic caste census 2011. Because we needed some data on literacy, etc., which are not easily available, or the number of MG Narega days, which is not there in the Mission Antyodaya. So we looked at other official sources of the data. The second thing that I would like to, state upfront is currently our regression results are not really causality results. They are broadly association results. Yeah, so when I say clean drinking water is associated with lower mortality or lower infant malnutrition, I'm not really saying that clean drinking water causes malnutrition to go down, because I really don't have that kind of before after kind of a scenario to evaluate policy in this. Now this survey is going to be carried out every year, so maybe next year or year after that we'll have a kind of a panel to say that, but currently we are only talking about associations really. But I think even at the association levels this is important, because the idea is not to really say something in terms of causation, but point the discussion in the direction of answering this big question: what should you do where? And I think so more nuanced kind of a convergence across departments. So that is the kind of a question that we are asking. So the idea is to really initiate a discussion. Right, and we are initiating this discussion with, for example, the Department of Rural Development, various Jilla Parishad CEOs, district collectors, project officers of the ITDP, so that to kind of carry this further, so that it helps them in making plans. Yeah. So the data sources we are using are here. So under nutrition, percentage of 0 to 6 year children Anganwadis are underweight, percentage of GPs having an Anganwadi, percent of children Anganwadis with complete immunization, percent of scheduled caste population. So all these are at the block level. In Maharashtra, block and taluka are the same. So it is effectively at the taluka level as well. Whereas in some of the states like UP, taluka might have several development blocks. I think in Karnataka also there are like blocks are a few more than talukas. But in Maharashtra, talukas and blocks are exactly identical. This is taluka block level or taluka level, the way you interpret this, right? Now, what we have done is, so in each taluka, for example, PDS would mean percentage of gram panchayats that have a PDS divided by the total number as a ratio of the total number of gram panchayats in the taluka, right? So we have data for everything like that, right? And everything has been scaled by the state value. So for example, you'll take the figure for the gram panchayats, total number of gram panchayats in the taluka divided by the, having PDS divided by total number of gram panchayats. The whole thing will be divided by corresponding figure for the state. Right, so that if this number is more than 100, then we know that we are doing better than the state. If this number is less than 100, we know that this taluka is doing worse than the state. Yeah. So this is the data. We have data on percentage of non-working females, which comes from census. Female literacy percent comes from census. Percentage of ST population comes from the census. Yeah, then percent of GPs that have an ATM, percent GPs with working internet access, percent GPs with access to all weather roads, percent GPs with electricity supply for MSME units, GPs with a PDS outlet, percent GPs that have a common service center, percentage of GPs with at least 8 hours of day electricity supply, GPs at least 50% inhabitants covered with habitations covered with pipe drinking water, for GPs with regular markets, for GPs having an indoor-outdoor public ground, percent of GPs having a PHC, CHC, subcenter or access to healthcare within 2 kilometers, percent GPs having access to veterinary care within 5 kilometers, percent GPs without any drainage facility, percent of households engaged in agriculture. This comes from ACCC. Total mandates generated under NREGA at the block level for 2014-15, 15-16, 16-17. So this is sum of all these, right? So this is a cumulative value, right? So how do we do that? Now, in the sense, the usual way to find an association like this would be do a regression, where your Y variable is the percentage of children malnourished in each taluka. So there'll be 360 talukas like this, and your X variable will be all these, right? And you'll get a beta coefficient, which will be common to the state, right? Okay, so you will, for example, say that if you have pipe drinking water, then that reduces malnutrition by, say, 0.1%. This number will be common across the state. But when you're looking at spatial data, those relationships won't work in the same way across the state. That is the whole idea behind this exercise. So there are very specific there are location specific effects. So we look at a modeling methodology. It's called geographically weighted regressions, where the marginal effects, that is the beta coefficients in the regression, are not constant across the entire geography, but are actually functions of the latitudes and longitudes. So our function has very specific geographic values. Right, so each taluka would have its own beta coefficient for each of the explanatory variables. Right, so you would have a different effect of water, access to pipe drinking water for different talukas. Yeah, so you get taluka specific regression coefficients really. So this is a little different from the random effects model. Random effects model, the beta coefficients vary randomly, whereas here the beta coefficients are specific functions of the latitudes and the longitudes of the talukas. Right. So we have this kind of, as you can see, this is a regression, and there's a lot of work now coming in. There is a man called Fotheringham, who's really the kind of father of all this geographically weighted regression. That kind of work is used a lot in health studies, in epidemiology, etc. Its use in economics hasn't been so much, but I think it has a lot of use also in areas like macroeconomics, etc. And one must have to explore that direction. Right. So, the latest papers are Combers et al. And there is a very nice book by Kobzhevska, 2019, which is Spatial Statistics and Econometrics with R. I think anybody who's interested in this should definitely have a look at that book. Right, so basically what you do is you fit a separate regression for each taluka. Right, that is the whole idea. And how do you do that? So you define a neighborhood around each taluka, a geographical neighborhood around each taluka, and use data in that geographical neighborhood to do this regression. Now, two key ideas are involved. One is, what do I mean by the neighborhood? The technical term for that is the bandwidth. Yeah, so basically when I say choose a particular bandwidth, I choose a particular neighborhood. So it could probably be, for example, the nearest 40 talukas. When you look at the geographical, if you define distances from the middle of a particular taluka to say its adjoining taluka, and then you choose 40 of these which are the nearest neighborhoods, you call it the 40 nearest neighborhoods. So that would be one way of doing it. Or alternatively, what you could do is you could say that, so this becomes a problem if your some talukas are very big and some talukas are very small. So in talukas which are very big, the neighborhood numbers will be small. So relatively few talukas will come in. Whereas talukas which are geographically small, you might get a lot of talukas because the same geographical area would now cover a lot more talukas. So to do that, to avoid that, there is something called the adaptive bandwidth, which actually selects just a fraction of the whole data set around a particular. So if I say the bandwidth is about 0.2, then about 20% of the nearest observations from any observation will be taken to do this regression, right? And I'll talk about more about the selection of the appropriate bandwidth is critical to what we are doing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The second is, the idea is, of course, that if I'm doing this regression for a particular taluka, and if I once have selected the neighborhood, then the data for all the matrix is created where I use data. So my X matrix, X matrix, my X matrix will be the matrix of all the values in the surrounding, in the neighborhood talukas with weights declining with distances. Okay, weights will decline with distances, and the most usual function is what is called the Gaussian weight function. So that, the further off a taluka is, the lower its weight is. But that's by and large the that's called the kernel, and the commonly used kernel is the Gaussian kernel, which is used for continuous data. But there is a whole host of kernels that can be chosen. So kernel choice here is the Gaussian kernel. How do I define the bandwidth? Now that is a very interesting question that we have, right? The point is, it's important to realize that if you have, say, different explanatory variables in the model, so y is a function of x1, x2, x3, the spatial scales on which x1 will work will be different from the spatial scale on which x2 will work, might be different from the spatial scale on which x3 might work. So for example, some variables might have a global impact, the same global impact across the entire geography. Some variables might have very localized impact. So the bandwidths will have to differ. Right, so we have a way of selecting. There's a very recent paper by Lee, I think 2022, that's a PhD dissertation under Fotheringham, in which there is a detailed discussion of how actually one can select a separate bandwidth for each of the Now, in general, how is the bandwidth decided? How do you find the bandwidth? So what you do is, suppose you're using an adaptive bandwidth, right? So you're using a fixed proportion of the data to do the regression. Then what you do is, you would first choose, say, a certain bandwidth, say 0.1. When you choose a certain 0.1, you have 360 talukas. So you will fit a regression for each of the talukas except one particular taluka, randomly left. Then you would predict for that one particular taluka, and you will find the residual sum of squares for that taluka. Right? Okay. You would do this exercise for the same bandwidth several times over. So you would get, and each time you would choose a different taluka randomly to be left out. This is called leave one out. Right? And then what you do is you would average the mean squared error across all these. And then say this is the average mean squared error for my leave one out cross validation at 0.1 bandwidth. Then you would increase the bandwidth to 0.11 or 0.12, 0.13 and keep on doing this. And then find the bandwidth and then choose the bandwidth which gives you the lowest average mean squared error in the cross-validation, leave one out cross-validation exercise. It's computationally a very intensive exercise, but that's why I've called it a data-driven approach. So that's how you choose the individual bandwidths there. Now, once the bandwidth is chosen, the process for selecting the variable specific bandwidth is a little bit more involved, but by and large works out the same way. Those who are interested can look at Lee's paper, which we have cited here, right? Lee 2020. Yeah. So now, okay, the other challenge that we have, is what are the variables that should go into the regression model? I have all this list of variables that we really don't know. What are the variables that would impact malnutrition? For example, does access to electricity reduce malnutrition? We don't know. There is literature for Bangladesh which says it does, but there is not much literature for India. Does access to pipe drinking water reduce malnutrition? Probably it does, because a lot of malnutrition comes results from waterborne diseases. But we really don't know how various variables work. For example, an argument usually made in the government is that MG Narega is very important for malnutrition because if there is MG Narega work, then people don't migrate for work in the lean season of agriculture. And typically when people migrate for work, they take their children along. So whatever data we was working with in the government indicated that when kids come back from their migration, their nutrition status really suffers. And if there is something which is going to prevent migration, then that would have an impact. So these are all variables which we know anecdotally. We don't really know how they are in a technical sense associated. In a very rigorous microeconomic modeling sense, they are associated. So what we've done is we've said, okay, let's choose which of the data. Let us find from the data which variables ought to enter the regression. The usual way would be to depend on the T statistic, but you can't do that here. You can't do that here because our variables are also highly correlated across the state. So districts which have a high level of, say, pipe drinking water would also probably have high levels of access to electricity. And you know that when you do that, the T values are understated. So you can't really use the T values, right, to actually, correlationality of variables is a problem. So what we've done is we have used the technique called a forward selection technique using the Ekaiki information criterion. So what we do is once we have chosen a particular bandwidth for the regression using all the variables possible, then we take the variable y and then take each individual variable separately, which is regressed on y. Okay. And then we find the AIC, Ekaiki information criterion, which essentially is the distance between our model and the true theoretical model. And we have to minimize that. So for example, suppose across all the variables that we have, suppose say access to public distribution system has the lowest AIC. So we retain it in the model, then keeping it in the model, take all the other n-1 variables, put them one by one into the regression model. And then suppose you now find that the combination of PDS and access to electricity is the combination with the lowest AIC. Then you retain that and you keep on choosing the third variable and so on. So that is how you choose iteratively. Ultimately, you kind of get a full model. You keep on doing this. All the variables are exhausted. So we get something like 600 odd models like this. And among all these models, you choose the model with the lowest AIC. Okay, so that is the forward selection. And if you do that, then the variables which come out in the forward selection are these. Okay, electricity, school, vocational, PDS, these are the variables. Now, so we do a regression. Okay, overall, the model adjusted R square is 0.67. Okay, which is quite good. And this is a pseudo R square really, because you're not minimizing the sum of squared errors, but you are really taking the ratio 1 minus the ratio of the likelihood of the null model to the full model. So it is about 0.67, right? Okay. As I said, T's are not very useful in view of collinearity, but we have depended upon the AIC. That's the best we can do. So now this comes the interesting parts of the finding. Right. So, for example, these graphs show you what is the impact of PDS outlet on child malnutrition. So you see 4 different colors here. What have I done? So think of the impact of PDS on malnutrition. Let beta be that coefficient. Now we've got 360 values of beta. Okay. So I've broken the 360 values of beta into 4 parts. One is the range from the lowest value of beta to the mean value of beta minus the standard deviation of beta. So that's one range. And I've given it one color. That is the left-hand side, the mauve color that you see or whatever. Then from the mean of beta to mean of beta minus standard deviation of beta is another band. Mean of beta plus standard deviation of beta is another band, and and from that to the maximum beta. So 4 bands. So naturally, any variable will have these 4 colors, but if you can look at PDS outlet, the PDS outlet, you see access to PDS outlets reduces malnutrition, and that number is very similar across, right? The number doesn't change much. Okay, so PDS has a very similar impact, and so the same thing that you can find is access to electricity. Actually, there's a strong impact on malnutrition, and that impact is also very similar across the entire state. Pipe drinking water also reduces malnutrition. Again, a very similar impact, right? The impacts don't vary. Health infrastructure, however, has a different impact in different regions of the state. Yeah, so for example, in this part, which is the darkest part, right? This is the tribal belt of Maharashtra, this is Jawar, Dahanu, Palghar, etc., right? Thane district and part of it, where the impact is the highest, right? Whereas if you come to the eastern part of Maharashtra, this is Gadchiroli, again, tribal areas where the impact is the most muted. Right, and by infrastructure we meant as a health infrastructure, we meant whether you have a community health center or a primary health center or a sub center in the gram panchayat, or if the nearest public health facility is at least 2 kilometers away. So if you look at MG Narega, that's very important. So MG Narega has a widely different impact on malnutrition in the state. The strongest impact you see is the darkest color here, and that is the Marathwada region of Maharashtra. And as you know, Marathwada region is very famous for migrant sugarcane workers, sugarcane cutting workers. It's a drought-prone region, and in the lean season, lots of people migrate with children for sugarcane cutting. With children actually. So, and it's, so that is probably why the impact is the strongest here, whereas the weakest impact is on the coastal parts of the state. Now, this is also the wealthiest region of the state, and where because ordinarily wages are sufficiently high so that there isn't much demand for MG Narega work. So if you have to look at focus on MG Narega work, this is where MG Narega work is likely to be the most potent in reducing malnutrition. Anganwadis also have similar impacts on malnutrition across the board. Right, female literacy reduces malnutrition, as you can see. Female literacy reduces malnutrition, as you can see, and female literacy has a very similar impact across the state. Female non-workers, so percentage of women who are not working also has an impact on malnutrition. So if I higher the percentage of women who are not working, lower is the extent of malnutrition. That's probably because when women kind of conditions under which women work, they probably have to substitute childcare time to for work time, and that probably accounts for. Now, availability of post offices also reduce malnutrition. Okay, and there is a belt. That's where the post office impact is very strong. We don't know why, but when that's it, as I said, the point here is to start a discussion, right? So there is a belt here in Maharashtra where post office access to post office has the strongest negative impact on malnutrition. Agricultural occupations. So when households are typically engaged in agricultural occupations, you actually have lower malnutrition. And that's probably because there is a certain amount of nutritional security that comes from family being engaged with agriculture itself. But that impact is also very similar across the state. But playgrounds have an impact. So if you have access to playgrounds, data shows that there is an impact on malnutrition. That impact, again, as you see, is widely varied across the state. So there are some pockets that impact is particularly strong. Similarly, libraries, access to public libraries also has an impact on malnutrition. Maybe it spreads information, knowledge, or whatever. We don't really know how the dynamics works, but the association seems to be strongest in the rightmost part of the state here. Yeah. and not so important in uh, the northern part of the state here. Access to financial inclusion definitely reduces malnutrition, and access to ATMs has a very similar negative impact on malnutrition. Access to banks also has a very similar impact on malnutrition across the state. But access to banking correspondent is also important in reducing malnutrition, and the impact is widely varied. In some parts of the state, the impact is rather strong. In some parts of the state, the impact is not so strong. Again, interestingly, access to markets, if you have a regular market in the village, then in some places it reduces malnutrition, some places it does not reduce malnutrition. Right? So maybe access to markets on the one hand provide better livelihoods. So people can obviously get better incomes and lives can become better off, and that's why malnutrition might go down. But also the argument is that when you have access to markets, you also have cheap and non-nutritious foods flooding the market. For example, the Tehsil town where I stay in, it's common to find across grocery shops, the stores now pizza bases and biscuits. So early morning diets for kids are now having more and more of maida and biscuits, and traditional foods are going away because they are convenient foods, right? And it's easy to give the child a packet of biscuits for breakfast, and that's also cheap, much cheaper than cereals or milk or eggs or anything of that kind. So markets have a mixed impact on malnutrition, and we can see which parts of the state markets have what kind of impact on malnutrition. So the proportion of scheduled caste population everywhere has a positive impact on malnutrition. So even if you control for everything else, if the percentage of Dalits in a particular tehsil goes up, then you will have more malnutrition. And the same thing for tribals. So by itself, when everything else is also constant, when you control for everything else, the percentage of Dalits and tribals seems to be associated with more malnutrition across. Interestingly, all-weather roads, right? If you have access to all-weather roads, you will feel that should reduce malnutrition everywhere, but it doesn't. It reduces malnutrition only in this part of the state, right? Part of the Gadchiroli, Gondia, the really inaccessible parts of the state. But there are certain ranges of the state where actually access to roads might even worsen malnutrition. That's probably because it changes. For example, if you have better access to roads, again, as I said, the whole diet profiles of children and family change, right? Maybe families might have been eating coarse cereals and other things, which they start selling in the market. They start buying cheaper foods. Women start working in conditions which are not exactly, which are very labor intensive, to spend a lot of time for work outside household, and therefore childcare suffers, but there is no other primary childcare giver because the family structures now change. And so basically that kind of a mixed story is told from this. And similarly for primary schools, this result we have not been able to understand why. When you have access to primary schools, that's also associated with a greater measure of malnutrition. That's probably because there is also more counting. We are still not very sure about how to understand this result, but there is a strong positive association. And that probably because if you have more greater intensity of schools in a taluka, then it's probably also that Anganwadis in the taluka are more intensely monitored. There is better counting of children or so on, but we don't really know that result, right? Now the point is, so what does this tell you? What are the policy implications of this? One straightforward policy implication is that there are some variables like access to PDS, access to electricity, which definitely reduce malnutrition, and their distribution across the state is very uneven. Yeah, so what you have before you is the geographical spread. So how do you measure spatial concentration? There is something called a Moran's eye, which is a kind of a measure of spatial correlation. So think of a taluka and think of say the percentage of schools in that taluka, and then think of the percentage of schools in the neighborhood of that taluka. The neighborhood of the taluka is called a spatial lag. Right. So what Moran's-I really measures is the correlation between a variable and its spatial lag, its surrounding neighborhood. And if that correlation is positive and statistically significant, it means that if you pick up a taluka at random, and if that taluka has a higher than average level of access to schools, then the talukas around that talukas will also have a higher than average access to schools. If you take a taluka which has a lower than average access to schools, then talukas around that taluka will also have a lower than average access to schools, right? So that's Moran's I is how you measure spatial correlation. What we have done is here actually the red talukas are talukas which have high levels of access, surrounded by talukas which have high levels of access. The yellow talukas are talukas which have low levels of access and which is surrounded by talukas with a low level of access. Green talukas are islands of excellence. So they have high levels of access but surrounded by talukas with low levels of access. And the orange ones are exactly the other way around. They have low levels surrounded by high levels, right? Now you see there's a clear geographical distinction in Maharashtra, right? So for example, if you're looking at pipe drinking water in Maharashtra, then you see clearly two regions, one the northern region and the southwestern region, where most of the access is concentrated. And the yellow region, if you look at the eastern Maharashtra, then that region is particularly the low surrounded by low. Same thing for PDS outlets, right? You clearly see regions. Yeah, again, for example, clustering of, so basically electricity access. So almost everything in Maharashtra is clustered like that. So one simple policy story immediately tells you is, look here, if access to electricity has the same kind of impact across the state, but then there are talukas, there are whole patches where access to electricity is lower than the average. And these are areas where you really need to focus on this particular intervention. Okay. Similarly, if you look at, so basically this is really the kind of clustering that you have of MG Narega, if you have clustering of nearly all public amenities, right? Like if you look at Anganwadis, for example, Anganwadis you see are largely clustered in this left region, right? But most of eastern Maharashtra seems to be the low surrounded by low, right? So there's a whole geographical space surrounded by low. So I said, how can this help? This can initiate a discussion about what works where, right? So at one level, it can initiate a discussion about what you really need to know. For example, there are certain parts of the state where you need to have more PDS, for example, or more, better access to PDS, better access to electricity, better access to pipe drinking water, even when pipe drinking water or PDS have the same impact across the state. So one, it tells you where to actually take these variables more, because even when the variables have the same impact across the state, their availability is low in certain regions, and this method clearly identifies those talukas and those geographies for you to work on. So this is where you need to look at this. Secondly, it also tells you, what also, like for example, MG Narega or roads, right? So roads don't have the same impact everywhere, right? So maybe where it tells you where you should focus on the roads, where probably roads are not really improving the malnutrition situation. You need to look at that further and understand how the dynamics are working out, right? Before you really say that we're going to construct more roads, because so idea is that it says that there is not really a one size fits all solution for everything, right? So this is what in this particular case this tells you. But I see its value as a statistical technique. So this can be replicated at different geographical levels, right? This can be replicated for different problems at varying spatial levels, blocks, districts, etc. Right? You can also do in the future, you can do a panel data so that this actually the Mission Antyodaya data will be repeated every year. So you can actually do a panel kind of a survey, and very soon you'll also have the census 2021, which should have been taken place, and also the we are now thinking of the socioeconomic caste census also will be repeated. So you can actually do at least 2 data points. So you can actually look at more nuanced ways of evaluating policies and bringing in causality, which unfortunately with the current data I really cannot bring in. Now the catch here is that there is all the X variables are highly correlated. If you have multicollinearity, then you know that that's a problem for standard errors. So the T values cannot be easily interpreted. So that's a problem. The second problem is, because so when I'm using a 5% level of significance, for example, what am I saying? I'm saying that I'm allowing for a 5% chance of wrongly rejecting the null hypothesis. That is what is meant by thinking of a 5% level of significance. Now 5% level, suppose I'm having 360 T values, one for each taluka. then 5% of 360 t values is about 15 or 16 t values. Right, so it says that in 15 or 16% talukas, I will actually go wrong, and that's too big a number. Right, so when you're taking many t-value t tests at one time, there is this multitude test is a problem, right? And there is a bias there. So there is a Bonferroni correction for it, but it doesn't create completely resolve the problem. So there is now a solution. Ma, Zhu, and Yu paper 2020 can provide a solution. In addition to that, Bayesian special methods are also now coming up, where this problem of multicollinearity doesn't really exist. Omitted variable bias will also not be a problem. Those kinds of methods are slowly evolving, and we're also trying to kind of find the, work out the math of it. It's not as straightforward as our usual methodologies. And the third problem will be that we would like to do this for an all India level, really. But for an all India level, the computing capabilities that we require will be really, really large, because you can see this is a highly computation oriented kind of an exercise. So you might have to put it on, say, maybe some Hadoop or some kind of a big data technology where this can be done. But I think this is worth doing because it gives us a more nuanced approach to policy and helps us drive the direction on on Gram Panchayat plans and decentralization about what would work where, instead of having kind of one solution fits all kind of approaches. So this is all that I had to say here. I've deliberately kept it short and crisp so that if there are questions now, we'll be more than happy to take those questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Neeraj sir.
Yeah.
Is my voice coming through clearly?
Yeah, surely.
Okay. So thank you for that. That was really fascinating. I especially like the idea of bringing rigorous econometric proof to the point that very often one size does not fit all. That's very often a qualitative argument that's forwarded. So this was really interesting. So I have a very little question. I mean, the audience are free to raise hands, and then I'll be able to unmute you and so that you can ask your question. But I'll just kick off with one little question. So I was struck by the initial several graphs that you, not graphs, maps that you displayed. How come they're all in bands? How come the shading, the range of influences, whether we are talking about NGNREGA work, yes, these ones, how come they are all in bands? Does this have something to do with the fact that what you said about using geographic location, the latitude, longitude, and your
basically what you do is, there is a beta hat, there is a coefficient computed for each taluk, right?
Yes.
So my model gives you, if you have 360 talukas, for example, the impact of pipe drinking water will be able to estimate it differently for each taluka. So there will be 360 values for the coefficient of that particular variable, say X. Now what I've done is that variable I've broken into 4 parts, right?
Yes.
Broken into 4 ranges. One is the range from the lowest value of beta hat. Yeah. Lowest value of beta hat. Lowest value of beta hat to one, which is say the mean of beta hat to the standard deviation of beta hat, right?
Yes.
So mean of beta hat minus standard beta hat will be one range. From that, lowest will be one range. Mean of beta hat to plus standard deviation of beta hat will another range, and mean of beta hat plus standard beta hat to max of beta hat. So 4 ranges, and I've just given them different colors, right? But those colors are relevant only when the variables are changing dramatically across. Yeah.
Like in the top one here.
Yeah, like the top one here. Right. But otherwise, if you look at, say, pipe drinking water or say ATM, then the ATM, if you look at the legions below, then the ATM will have the same, it has the same impact everywhere.
Yes.
Yeah. ATM has the same impact everywhere. Yeah. So, so basically, in that case, the ranges are not so very relevant, really. Okay, but they are particularly relevant in, say, in this regular markets and child malnutrition.
Yes.
Yeah. Where regular markets will have different impacts on different. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But how?
Just give me a second. Somebody at
Please
the
take
door.
your time. No problem. Take your time.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So I guess what I understand the brackets, the four ranges that are created. What I'm wondering is how is it that if we look at the regular markets in child nutrition, how is it that all the blocks in the northeast end of Maharashtra, how is it that all of those taluks happen to fall within the under negative point one
Yeah,
two?
so what it says is this is a particular part of Maharashtra. So this is a neighborhood where the impact of roads or impact of markets have a negative impact on child malnutrition, right? And this is because so this whole area is actually one particular the Gondia Gadchiroli part of Maharashtra, right?
Okay.
Which is a highly tribal kind of a belt, yeah,
Hmm.
and with very poor accessibility.
Okay.
Right, so markets here are so for example, I know localities here where the rainy season the situation is so bad that you can actually just buy everything and then you can't step out of the home, you can't access a market for 4 or 5 months, right? So
Ah.
this is that kind of a topography. So it's probably here where access to markets might be giving you more diversified diets, giving you more jobs or that kind of a thing. But in other places access to markets can have variety of other
Right.
implications, which like for example in where I stay, uh, my grocery stores are regularly selling pizza bases. It's a small
Ah.
town, Tehsil, but
Ah.
across the counter grocery shops have pizza bases and biscuits, and there's a demand here where the largest selling out commodity is biscuits, because normally now mothers, the packet of glucose biscuits is really the breakfast for a lot of kids now, because there
True.
are markets, mothers go and work, and that's the easiest way of kind of resolving that problem, the easiest and the cheapest way really. So
Right.
different kinds of foods come, food habits change. So it's a very complex relationship. We don't really know, but that's how it seems to work. And the
Got it.
idea is that this will at least start a discussion about why different things work differently in different regions.
Absolutely. That makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Mr. Yogesh. You may please
Yeah,
go ahead and ask your question.
right.
Mr. Yogesh, are we audible? Maybe an issue, but there is a
Uh,
question.
yeah,
Ah,
yeah.
yes, please go ahead.
Yeah.
Good evening, sir. It's
Good
a
evening.
good presentation, and I have one question. Uh, you are telling about the Dalit area and tribal areas, or more malnutrition is going, right? And if
Yeah.
so, the any Yojana or Abhiyan coming for existence to reduce this problem,
Uh, you see, we
and what is the precautions to minimize the problem of the future dimension?
so basically, Yogesh, this whole idea is the whole presentation is about saying what works where. Okay.
Hmm.
So, for example, in certain tribal areas, for example, we know that better access to markets would reduce malnutrition, or access
Okay.
to public libraries would reduce malnutrition, right?
Hmm.
Or access to electricity would reduce malnutrition, but we don't have enough electricity in those
Yeah.
regions. Right?
Yes. Yes.
So,
Yes.
this is the set of policies which is coming out from this that needs to work. Okay,
Yeah.
and I think why do tribals? I think one of the problems, one of the reasons why scheduled caste, for example, typically
Yeah.
associated. I don't show that graph here, but if you look at the concentration of Dalits in Maharashtra, right, you actually those red graphs which you see also. So
Yes.
Dalits are not
Yes.
everywhere. Dalits
Mm.
are typically in the the proportion of Dalits in all the rain-fed tracts of Maharashtra, right?
Mm.
Okay, so
Yes.
low rainfall, rain shadow areas is low. Most of the Dalits are in the deeper soil, better rainfall areas where they have actually been agricultural laborers.
Yes, yes.
Okay, right.
Mm.
And dependent in a patron-client kind of relationship on bigger landlords.
Mm.
Right. So
Yes.
basically, that is a huge cluster. So Dalits have not really been able to shift out of their traditional locations as much as you would like to believe if you look at that picture, which I have not presented here. But
Mm.
so the point really is also, shifts from non-agricultural, shifts from agricultural occupations to non-agricultural populations, better literacy, better access to public infrastructure in those areas, etc., etc. So that is what really would work.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Uh, if so, what are the years is required to go for the future, sir? If it
So
is a
future, what did I say?
better
Better,
access of market and electricity,
better
water
access to,
supply,
so for example, better
then they will
financial,
get that.
yeah, better financial integration, better
Uh,
female literacy, better access to clean drinking water, better. So a lot of public investment and public initiatives is
yes, yes.
it's quite important. And the
Yeah.
reason I'm saying this is because you see, at the level of policy, we still, even when we talk about convergence, we still speak on silos. Like, for instance, it is the Department of Tribal Development in Maharashtra, which
Mm.
is in charge of the health of tribals, but it doesn't spend money through its own. Right. What it does
Yes.
is it gives money to the Department of Women and Child Development, which then
Mm.
spends money on Anganwadis. So
Yes,
if we
yes.
want to find out how many, suppose that the Department of Tribal Development spends say 1,000 crores on supporting say pregnant tribal women, and if you
Mm.
ask them how many women actually benefited, then there is no data because the money is routed through Women and Child Development Department, where the Women and Child Development Department itself doesn't maintain any data on whether a beneficiary is a tribal or a non-tribal.
Yes.
So we really have no way of knowing that, right? Whether money spent by Tribal Development Department is working on that. So
Yes,
this
yeah.
is
Here is to the health department and also the social welfare department
social
have
welfare.
to be
Social welfare doesn't look
assess.
after
Yeah.
STs in Maharashtra.
Uh,
Social welfare is
uh,
for the scheduled castes, yeah.
uh,
And
yes, tribal is for the this.
yeah, tribal STs.
Yeah, this too has to be work and you have to keep
Yeah,
the records and all that to
right.
minimize it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your solution. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you,
for that
ma'am. Thank you.
question. Yes, no problem. There is one more question in the chat box. I'll just read it out.
Right.
So this person says, I'm a beginner in spatial econometrics. My question
Mhm.
is, what is the difference between spatial error model, spatial lag model, and weighted regression model?
See, they are different. What is the special? So basically, why do we require to account for space? Because as you know, when we do a usual regression, suppose I have a set of say y variables and x variables, then the assumption is that they are a random sample from a population. But when geography is involved, y's and x's are likely to be highly clustered. So for instance, if your y variable is the percentage of area and the sugarcane in a taluka, and x is the percentage is the number of sugarcane crushing mills in a particular taluka, then y will not be random. Y will be a part of a geography, a belt which geographically suited to sugarcane cultivation. And also the sugarcane cultivation in my taluka might not be dependent on whether I have a sugarcane crushing mill in my taluka, but whether I have a sugarcane crushing mill in an area which is reasonably reachable. Right. So therefore there will be a lot of kind of clustering of data. When there is clustering of data, when you do a regression is a problem. So in a usual so basically one way in which you allow for a special error model is you have a regression equation where the beta coefficients are constant across the area, but the error terms are allowed to be spatially correlated. So if the error term in the regression for a particular taluka could be correlated with the error term for the surrounding talukas to account for the clustering, right? That's a special error model. Or you might have a model where the special autoregressive model where the variable y could be correlated with variables surrounding that y. So area and the sugarcane in a particular taluka, if you're modeling as a y variable, then that could be correlated with areas in the surrounding. Obviously, it will be correlated with clustering. So that's a special lag model. You could also model with the x variables. That's an entirely spatially mixed model. But in those models, the alpha and beta coefficients are constant across the geography, right? You'll get a single alpha and beta. Only thing is you would have accounted for clustering, which would give you unbiased results, unlike a geography regression. Whereas here what we are saying is, we are saying that the beta coefficient is not constant across the geography. The beta coefficients depend upon the latitudes and the longitudes. Yeah. So there will be a separate beta coefficient for each taluka. Now, if you run the regression for the entire state and assume this a beta across the state, then you would get a biased beta. Whereas if you actually try to get a beta for each taluka individually, then you'll get lots of betas, a lot of variance, but unbiased betas. So when you do this regression, you are really trying to trade off the bias and the the variance and minimize the mean squared error and find a separate regression coefficient for each of the talukas. Right, so there will be 360 regression coefficients here. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there is another. So this person has another follow-up question. Which software did you use for the maps?
This is R.
R. Okay. Actually, Vikash, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? I'll just unmute you 1 minute. Vikash, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sheetal, and thanks, Professor Hatekar. It's such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
So, how beneficial is this method, geographically weighted regression, vis-a-vis OLS? You did mention something, but do we gain a lot out of it?
Yes, because OLS you would get a same. The problem with OLS is suppose pipe drinking water has different impacts on different parts of the geography, right? Or access to markets might have different impacts on different parts of the state. Now, if you have a common OLS across the state and if you have a common impact, then that impact is actually can be shown to be a biased estimate. Yeah. The critical idea is that different policies will have different, policies will have to be, so policies will work differently in different parts of the state. Yeah. So that is not what you'll get through an OLS, right?
So as I understand, this thing that is done by geographically weighted regression cannot be done with simple OLS, right? So
no, because for an OLS, OLS is
exactly
like a geographically weighted regression if you think of the bandwidth as the whole geography. But then you get a single estimate, but that estimate will be biased. Yeah, because what one needs to realize is that different variables work at different spatial scales, no? So Narega might work at a different spatial scale compared to, say, financial inclusion. And for which then those different neighborhoods will have to be defined accordingly.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
All right. Are there any more questions? Bipin, have you raised? Yes, I'll
Sure.
Okay, go ahead, Bipin.
Yeah, hi, sir. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Bipin.
Okay, so my question is, in this kind of a model, a neighborhood selection method that you are going to use turns out to be critical, right?
That is the critical part. Yeah.
Okay, now what if instead of using this kind of a method, what if I just use some dummies for these locations?
But you will not have, because you will, if you have 360 data points and 360 dummies, how will you work it out?
Okay. Okay, so in that case, you need to have the way you define your neighborhood turns out to be critical, right?
Yeah.
So are you going to use a distance band? I mean, do you specify it manually or is it predetermined since you have geographical locations of taluks?
What you do is basically, as I said, we, if you use a distance band, then there is a, that's called a fixed bandwidth. But that what happens with a fixed bandwidth is assume that your geography is that some talukas are very big and some talukas are very small. Okay. So if you have this bandwidth is say 15 kilometers. Yeah. So if I say that 15 kilometers around my, I'm going to fit a separate regression for my each taluka using the data in 15 kilometers around this taluka. So in some cases, I might get a lot of talukas. In some cases, I might get very few talukas, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So basically what you do is, you can use what is called an adaptive bandwidth, which is a certain section of the data. But how do you choose an adaptive bandwidth? So an adaptive bandwidth, essentially you start with a particular bandwidth. Then you actually estimate this regression for all talukas except one taluka. Yeah. Calculate the predict for that taluka, calculate the mean square error on that, repeat this exercise hundreds of times, each time leaving out a different taluka randomly, then average all those errors and call it the mean squared error for a bandwidth of 0.1. Then do this for bandwidth
Okay.
of say 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.4, and then choose the lowest, the bandwidth which has the lowest, which is called cross validation with leave one out.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So you basically, that is how you have to select the bandwidth.
Okay. Okay.
And
Got
then
it.
within another important idea you have to be worried about is what is called the kernel. So when I've chosen a particular bandwidth, I use all the data in that neighborhood, but with lower weights as you go further and further away from the taluka that you're working on.
Okay.
Okay. Now
Yes.
those weights, there has to be, so that function which distributes those weights is called the kernel function.
Okay.
Now there is a wide variety of kernel functions that can be used, right? Some kernel functions will measure data in a geography, as the crow flies distance. Some kernel functions you can use to use the data, depending on what you want to do, by the road, right? So your data, because you see each of the data points now has a latitude and a longitude here.
Okay. So you're saying that these kernels are like some kind of a weighting scheme?
Some kind of a weighting scheme, weighting depending upon the distances. And because you see the critical idea here is to use a shape file, right? So all these maps that you see, they come from a shape file. A shape file is a file of the talukas in Maharashtra where each taluka has a latitude and a longitude in the file.
Okay.
Right, so they're GIS objects. Now I
Yes.
put my rest of the data on the shape file. Okay.
Okay.
Now, because there are latitude and longitudes for each taluka, then my software can calculate distances.
Okay. Okay.
And with these distances, it can calculate the weights if I give it the right kernel function. If I also ask it to choose weights according to not as the crow flies, but as the nearest roads, for example, then it can also do that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I get it. I think I kind of get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Varun, you can please go ahead and ask your question. Mr. Varun? Okay.
I think Varun has a hand raised, but I can't hear him.
Yes. No, we unmute me, please. 1 minute. There's somebody who has. Okay. Mr. Varun, if you have a question, you may please go ahead and speak. I have unmuted you. If you're unable to, you can type in the chat. I have unmuted you. Varun, okay. Make a presenter. Change. All right. Mr. Varun, are you able to unmute and speak now?
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah, you're right.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for such a nice presentation, Professor Hatekar. I just wanted to know for the talukas which are bordering states like Karnataka, Telangana, and Madhya Pradesh, are you using taluka level information from those states?
No, but actually what I need to do is, what I really need to do is also put this, because the mission into the data is actually for the whole country. So what I need to do is, I've just looked at Maharashtra as a whole. So when I look at the neighborhood of the bordering taluka, it's only going to take the neighborhoods in the state inside, right? Okay, but you're right. I need to kind of look at the bordering regions as well. So I need to look at, I need to kind of put this map in the map with Chhattisgarh, in the Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Karnataka, Gujarat, Goa, and all that, and then kind of work on this. So I need to really look at that region. That's a good suggestion that we will. But you know what happens? Computational requirements here are really huge.
Right. I understand.
Okay, I mean, computation is a very intensive exercise. So I'll be able to do that, but I need to have access to more computing power.
I was just wondering if health facility is nearby my taluka, which is but it falls under some separate state, say Karnataka, then I might be benefiting from that health center, but this model may not be capturing that.
No, this model specifically captures neighborhood effects, right? Like, for example, I might be in a taluka. My taluka might not have a school or a college, but my neighboring taluka might have a college, and therefore that might have a higher level, there might be a lot of people going to college in my taluka, right? And that is why specifically the neighborhood ideas are important.
Correct. Correct.
Right. So that is the bandwidth that I give. But as you correctly said, suppose I'm looking at the tribal area, right? Then the border of the Maharashtra tribal areas that you see in the eastern Maharashtra, actually this is Abujmar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh boundary, right? Okay.
Right, right.
So this is all the terrain where the same type of Madian tribals live on both sides. The geographical conditions are the same. Inaccessibility issues are the same. So it is probable that if I'm not using that kind of a data, my idea of neighborhood might actually be getting a little bit misconstrued.
Right, right.
Or if I look at, say, the boundary between Maharashtra and Karnataka, that also is a part of the same ecological climatic zone, no? Semi-arid, dryland agriculture, etc. So that I need to do that, but that will increase my computational complexity a lot, and I'm figuring out how to do that.
Correct. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So does anybody else have any questions before we close? While I give everybody a half a minute to think about that, I'll just like to ask a question which I'm thinking of as the closing question. But if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Neeraj sir, so this is like you've said, this is computationally very intensive. But for the case of for the state of Maharashtra, you have completed a lot of the computation, and like you said at the beginning, all of this is suggesting association. Not causation yet. How do you propose to take this forward? I mean, from again, even in terms of qualitative analysis, combining that with what results you have now sounds like a pretty daunting task. So how do you see taking this forward?
See, I think one thing that we can do is, as I said, this Mission Antyodaya survey is going to be repeated every year. So by next year, I'll actually have a panel on this.
Right.
So if I have a panel, I might be able to model causation much more accurately. And more importantly, what I'm now doing with this is actually having a discussion with policymakers. Right. So I'm taking it to, for example, the Rural Development Secretary. I'm taking it to District Jilla Parishad CEOs. Right. And saying that, look here, in your area, this is how this variable seems to be working. Or PDS reduces malnutrition, but you don't have enough PDS. Right. So basically, it is that kind of, the idea here is really to work with policy and influence, give some kind of a thinking process, some way of in which policymakers can even organize their thoughts and have a baseline about what to do where. Right. So I think this is a kind of a tool where you initiate dialogue for public policy. And that dialogue is obviously iterative. No, it doesn't. So I think this idea that we have something in econometric models and some coefficient we have, and because some coefficient minus 0.33, this is how the Reserve Bank should act. I think that is not the right way to think about how econometrics would impact public policy. Because our results are contingent on a lot of things. So, it's basically, you need something substantive so that there can be a dialogue. There can be discussion and things can move ahead in a collaborative fashion, in a to and fro fashion.
Right, that makes sense. So does anybody have any questions before we close for today evening? Looks like that's it. So, and we are a little bit past the hour. So I think this is a good enough time for us to close. Yeah. So Neeraj sir, that was really fantastic and very interesting. The math is demanding for a lot of us, so we'd have to look at this in a little bit more detail. We'll be happy to have a look at your paper to help understand some of the computational work. This is really fascinating. Thank you so much for giving your time here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for attending. And whenever our next session is, the Base University Research Seminar presentation, the announcements will be sent out. We hope to see all of you again for the next session. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye. Good evening.